Hi guys, we're going to go over a few things in this video, mostly regarding genre and to kind of catch up a little bit regarding the readings you've done so far. At this point, you should have read Breathers chapters 1 through 10, right? And your discussion board post will have had something to say about that. Wednesday, you watched the Julia Kristeva Powers of Horror video. Or if you found it too disturbing or you were kind of worried about disturbing images, I also had posted the actual PDF for approaching objection, and you really only had to read the first 11 pages. If you plan on using this theory in any of your writing, I would go and like read the first 11 pages at some point, and that first 11 pages is definitely enough to give you kind of like a working knowledge of the theory. Um, and if you have questions about that, let me know. Kristeva is she's one of the French philosophers, and so some of her writing is a little, the French philosophers are famously difficult to understand at points, and were really in it. They were deep in the theory, so if you are interested in the theory, but you feel like you still don't totally get it, like definitely let me know. I'm so happy to talk about it. This is one of my favorite theories, um, and it's also like just a bizarre thing to get into, right? And it's really useful in terms of what we're looking at for this class, right? Especially in terms of like how do certain people get regarded as, abject? How do their bodies get like rejected in order for the like sort of social self or for society to think of itself in a specific sort of way? All of that kinds of stuff, right? Like Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster, of course, was an abject body because he was put together of various parts of dead bodies, which are immediately abject just in the fact that they're dead, right? And then on top of that, his appearance as this kind of like non-human entity also marks him as an abject body, right? And so people compulsively reject him, and it's more than just like him looking scary. It's sort of like a psychological need to reject him in order to establish that you are not like him, right? In order to establish that you are not inhuman looking or scary or any of that things, and to sort of um, establish this sense of self as like a normative human, and that requires objecting what you perceive as non-human or abnormal. So it's really fun stuff, and I'd be more than happy to talk about it more. Um, by this point, right by the end of the day today, you guys will have read some more poetry, right? I have a couple pieces by Plath for you, and Plath is uh, just a bizarre writer and writes about some really like complex ideas. She led a very interesting life. Um, and Neruda's Walking Around, which I think is another one that deals very directly with your sense of your own humanity as maybe something to reject or surpass in a sense. And then Dickinson's One Need Not Be a Chamber to Be Haunted, right? And then last week I had you guys read a couple pieces by Gloria Anzaldúa, Creature of Darkness and Letting Go. And both of these, I think, are really interesting poems in terms of what we're doing for the class, right? Is right in Creature of Darkness, she's literally conceiving herself, and her depression, right, in a sense, as this like non-human creature that like lurks in the dark, right? And she's basically taking this like an emotional and psychological state and turning it into a whole like sense of being or sense of identity as non-human. And then in Letting Go, you'll see her actually sort of like dissecting her own body in these kinds of like very weird ways, right? You see, you must plunge your fingers into your navel with your two hands, spill open lizards, horned toads, the orchids and sunflowers, turn the maze inside out, shake it, right? And she does this over and over and over in this kind of like ritualistic way in the poem, kind of like splitting herself open. And what comes out are these like non-human things, things that you would not expect to come out of a human body. And so the question is really like, what is she doing with this? Right? What is this achieving? What is she attaining? right, or communicating through dehumanizing herself and really aggressively dehumanizing her body in these weird ways. Um, so, and there's no like wrong or right answer to that question. Okay, so I have a little, just like a visual, a very, very unsophisticated visual aid here to look at some of these questions. But right, so far we've looked at we're looking at two novels, right? We've looked at Frankenstein and we're working on Breathers. You've read the short story, I'm a Zombie Filled with Love. You've looked at these poems here, the comic Monstrous, and two films. Right. And what I want to look at is think about these in terms of genre. Okay, so like what does a novel have to offer that poetry does not, or what does poetry have to offer that a novel doesn't, or any of these, how do we contrast these genres in terms of what they're doing and how they're speaking to us? Okay, so like who is speaking, for instance, um in Battle Angel Alita, right? What we have in Battle Angel Alita actually is an omniscient third person sort of perspective, right? There's no one speaking in the film in terms of like narrating, right? We're not being told um what's happening from a specific perspective. It's kind of this like floating godlike eye. We're just like watching these events with no real explanation of like why we have access to the story, right? Whereas in Warm Bodies, right, it's told we have a narrator. We have a first person narrative, actually, like the main character as a zombie talking to us about his experiences, and that kind of explains like, okay, this is why we're in this story, this is why we have access to it, is because we're being spoken to by the narrator, right? And then we have once again differences in genre and who's speaking in Frankenstein and Breathers, right? And so in Frankenstein, and I talked about this a little bit earlier in the semester, it's an epistolary format, right? It opens with a letter being sent from one guy who's like, "Oh, I'm trying to write my sister about this crazy thing that's happening, and you're not going to believe the insane thing that's going on here, which is that this guy got on the ship and came out of nowhere, and he's telling me the most and crazy, incredible story, right?" And so, for that time period, an epistolary format was the most like believable way, because that's how people receive stories most often, is like as letters, right? Whereas in Breathers, we've moved into a kind of like direct first person um, format that doesn't include letters or any kind of explanation of how we're getting the story. It's just like the main character is speaking directly to us about his thoughts and feelings on like a second to second basis, basically, right? And there's also the difference between these novels in terms of like where is the monstrosity position. So in Frankenstein, we occasionally get the monster's um perspective. We occasionally get his words and his sections, as I've mentioned before to you guys, are incredible. But in Breathers, right, the whole book is written from the monster's perspective. And so the question there is like, what do we gain from having the whole book told from the monster's perspective? Right? Same thing as like I'm a Zombie Filled with Love, same thing with Warm Bodies. Right? What do we get from this kind of like narrative closeness to the monster and the monstrous experience? Right, to that experience of being a non-human. Um, and I would suggest that, like Creature of Darkness and in particular, like Letting Go are two more pieces that like really, really like draw us into this experience of being non-human, right? So, one of the things you'll notice about poetry in particular is it doesn't have the kind of like structural constraints, right, that the novel does, or even the short story, or even film, right? Like a poem can jump in and out of of like first and third person. It can be structured in any way. It can use full sentences, half sentences, single words on a line. Poetry really has this capacity to move around structurally and rhetorically. And um, these, I think, are not maybe like the most dramatic visions of that. Like you'll see poems literally about a balloon that are shaped like a balloon or something like that kind of stuff. Like poetry can do anything at once. But just looking at the poems and looking at the way they tell bits and pieces of story without even completing a narrative arc often, like what do you get from that? What do you think is gained or lost in poetry's capacity to tell half stories or partial stories or just give us a glimpse of a feeling and to, maybe not even explain who is speaking in the kind of full terms that we're used to. I had to stop filming there for a minute because I am apparently being summoned to jury duty. Um, yeah, so again, thinking about genre, right? Novels have a specific length, right? Short stories have a specific length. Poetry actually, like think about epic poems. Poems can be the same length as a novel, and we think of them as short because we're used to seeing short poems at this point. But that's not necessarily a genre constraint. What they do have though is a kind of like a structural and like sentence level fluidity that other genres don't have. Um, and they don't have to rhyme or any of that stuff. So you know, kind of think really broadly about poetry and what it can do. And then we have our sort of like more visual genres, right? Like what is Monstrous doing that maybe Warm Bodies or Battle Angel Alita can't do, right? What is there in a comic that is not in a film or what's in a film, right? Like it's more easy to say like, oh yeah, films have like sound, they have soundtracks, they have all these things, right? But a more interesting question is like, what is a comic doing that a film cannot do, right? And so I almost think comics as existing somewhere between like novels and films where we are still actively sort of imagining. We're doing a lot of the imaginary and visual work in our heads with a comic, right? We're imagining the movements, we're imagining the voices, we're imagining the vibes, and so we're much more active participants in comics than we are in, say, right, a film, um, which is much more like a lot of the work is done for us, and we don't have to imagine that much extra stuff. Um, but again, like comics have um, certain genre constraints, right? Like they can only be so many pages long, right? They usually come in installments. The stories typically are stretched out over like multiple volumes and stuff like that, where you have films functioning most often as like a single piece, like a single cohesive piece um, that's told in one go, right? So again, um, think about genre when we're looking at these. Your question, right? The post, the discussion post question for next week will be about genre, and I'll be asking you to kind of like compare and contrast some of these different pieces in terms of what they're doing with the genre and like your opinion on what's doing the most. Um, so I'm gonna stop for now and probably do another post specifically on breathers and where we're at with breathers. So look for that. But and email me if you have questions.